So, several weeks back, I went and saw the Doctor Strange movie when it came out, and I'm actually somewhat embarrassed to say that now, but of course, at the time, I was interested in seeing just how heavy the New Age and occult themes would be in this latest translation of Marvel characters to the silver screen. And the short answer is, of course, that it absolutely promotes occultism and the New Age so strongly it could hardly be overstated. And in fact, I was honestly really taken aback by just how uncomfortable I felt sitting through that movie. So it left such a heavy impression on my spirit that honestly I had to ask God to forgive me for going to see it. And consequently, I was somewhat reluctant at first to even talk about this movie because I didn't want to come across like I was encouraging people to see it. I mean, even if they were like me going to see it out of curiosity or for research purposes or whatever. But then again, I realize that most people who were inclined to go see it have probably already done so, and those that haven't probably aren't going to go see it just because of this video, and especially if I'm able to do any justice to the points that I intend to make about the story itself and its blatant Gnostic agendas. And speaking of which, that was essentially why I chose to start off with this clip showing the Doctor in his first encounter with the so-called Ancient One, who gives him this rude awakening to the multiverse of spiritual dimensions by pressing upon his third eye and sends him hurtling through all these mind-bending dimensional gateways and transcendent teachings and all that stuff. And so very early on in the movie, this scene rapidly starts bombarding the audience with core New Age concepts such as the physical realm being an extension of consciousness itself, and how all these realms and realities can be manipulated if only you learn the rules by which they're governed. And they actually portray the whole idea of fractals, and fractals being an expression of how everything is connected to everything, and everything is repeated throughout all of creation in the large and the small and all that. But, I mean, the whole thing is just a celebration of occultism, obviously. And literally, the hero is a sorcerer. And specifically, he's a sorcerer who started out as a believer in materialistic science and in rationalism and the purely physical world, who then has his entire paradigm shattered. And he goes through this sort of rebirth into a new understanding that ancient Eastern philosophy and the mystic arts are, far more real than he'd ever imagined, and blah, blah, blah. So that, of course, is highly symbolic, representing, what the audience and the society as a whole is intended to eventually experience as well. That transition from the modernist materialist paradigm back into the mysticism and spirit science of the ancient occult ways. So we could go on and on about all that, but there are plenty of people out there already, dissecting all the symbolism and the little Easter eggs and, counting how many number 11s show up here and there and everything else till the cows come home. So I'm really not trying to bother with all of that stuff. But what I wanted to touch upon was just the ending, where there's this showdown with a godlike being called Dormammu, who's first referenced in that beginning astral trip sequence as the dark dimension, quote unquote, is first introduced and referred to as a place where, quote, powers older than time lie ravenous.
Dark places where powers older than time lie ravenous.
And the reason I wanted to talk about this is because it really just blew me away how this character and that whole scene just embodied the Gnostic concept of the Demiurge. Now, before people start typing up elaborate comments to educate me on one way or another as to how I don't properly understand the Demiurge, I'll say that let me just tell you right now that I fully understand that there's not a monolithic agreement amongst modern Gnostics as to what exactly the Demiurge is or what it represents. And, some believe it's an actual real being, and others believe it's just a concept or, a character, an archetype. Some believe it's the creator himself, and that the creator is indeed evil and tyrannical, and others believe that it's but a very ancient and powerful godlike being who's not the creator, but more of merely an organizer or an agent used in the construction and articulation of the creation. Other Gnostics will say things like, well, we're all the Demiurge in a way, meaning that they equate the Demiurge with the inner ego, the traits of selfishness and dominance, and something we must learn to deny in ourselves, and etc. But regardless of whatever specific views that various self-pronounced Gnostics might have of the Demiurge, there's still enough of a commonality and a general construct of the idea that we can see that it does indeed factor into the broader mystery school belief system. And as I wanted to point out today, it's something that we can actually see being represented in Hollywood all over the place once you start to recognize it. It's actually one of those things that is so common and so ubiquitous that for the most part we tend to not even really think about it, because it just seems like another universal plot device or universal character trait that spans human history. So, of course it would show up in drama and fiction. But I mean, obviously human history has seen its fair share of tyrants and dictators and emperors and hostile invaders and everything. So many would simply say that the Demiurge is a mythologizing of a basic element in the human condition, which is, a fair enough idea. But, when you look at something like Dormammu in this Doctor Strange film, it really does take it beyond just such general ideas about humanity, and what we see is this very direct, very specific portrayal of an ancient godlike being from another dimension who is bent on conquering and ruling all the realms, all the worlds, all the dimensions of existence. Okay, so spoiler alert. All right. In this movie, the occult superhero Doctor Strange defeats Dormammu, not by actually fighting him directly, because that would be impossible since Dormammu is apparently far too powerful to be defeated in direct confrontation, but rather because Doctor Strange is clever enough to sneak in a magical device into the dark dimension, a magical device which carries a piece of time inside of it. He's able to sneak time into the timeless, eternal dark dimension. Suddenly the befuddled Dormammu doesn't know what to do, and having been outwitted by this petty mortal who trapped him in a time loop. So while that might sound kind of silly, it actually very much resonates with a core underlying Luciferian concept, where God himself is viewed as a being who, though he might be all-powerful, or at least view himself as all-powerful, he's a being who can and must be defeated some way, somehow, because ultimately he is the real threat. God himself is ultimately the bad guy. He's the Satan figure in the Luciferian Mystery Babylon worldview. In their minds, God is the invader. God is the bloodthirsty, maniacal, tyrannical, psychotic, galactic despot seeking to enslave humanity. In their minds, the return of Jesus is an alien invasion, a hostile act of aggression, and an attack that must be stopped at all costs, using whatever technological and metaphysical means necessary. And so the more we see this kind of theme appearing in films, television, gaming, books, etc., the more alarming to me it becomes, because we start to realize that indeed the media propaganda machine is very much being utilized to instill this segment of the Luciferian belief into the minds of humanity as a whole. And so overall, it really just makes me think of the sorts of teachings that guys like Russ Dizdar have given on Revelation 19:19, where he actually teaches quite convincingly, from my view, that when we look at what Bible prophecy says and about the end and how the armies are gathered together at Armageddon, that in reality they are gathering together to make war against the return of Christ himself and not against each other. That was a pretty staggering idea when I first came across it several years ago, since I had never heard that idea my whole life when it came to Armageddon in the end. But the more you really look at what Revelation 19 says, and then consequently compare that to all the propaganda and to what the Luciferians themselves seem to believe and seem to be preparing for in a whole host of ways, it really does all kind of line up.
So maybe somebody out there is one of those soldiers that is charged. You feel just absolutely invincible. You find yourself out there in the future, you find yourself standing on the ground, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of soldiers like you, all gathered together. Super tech weapons, supernatural gateways, power charges the air, SDIs in the sky, planetary defense weapon systems. Somehow you're convinced the mark is on your wrist. The power you feel in worshiping the image of the beast, a Theron. You feel invincible because of the enhancement. Maybe it's transhuman, ultra-human. Maybe it's mutation, transmuted humanity. A super soldier in that day, a super soldier, a troop of Antichrist, Homo Satanus. Though that's not how you see him. A super leader, a supra-human. It's been years. Devastation has occurred on the planet. Judgments have fallen, and it seems as though that new kingdom has been hit deep and broad. Somehow in your mind you're convinced that you're saving the planet, you're saving the new super leader, you're saving the dream of a global, political, economic, militaristic. Somehow you believed that it would be a new environment. Somehow you believed that it would all be a whole new domain. But there you are in the future, standing on the ground. The tens or hundreds of thousands of you, your heads are cocked back looking into the sky because a gateway somewhere in space has opened. A door. In your view, it's the enemy. In your convinced view, the descent of Christ, the apocalypse Jesu Christu, the coming visible approach of God. You've been convinced somehow he is your enemy. The armies of the troops of Antichrist on the ground, you're looking straight up. Your weapons are there. You're in the machinery. You're in the skies. You're ready to press buttons. You feel the synchronicity of gateways supernaturally opened and operative, and it seems as though your team, your army, your equipment, your planetary defense weapon systems are indestructible, indefeatable. The light gets brighter coming down from outer space. The roar in the heavenlies seems